Peter Aiken. Now, Peter is an acknowledged data management authority, an associate professor at Virginia Commonwealth University, president of Data International, and he is the associate director of the MIT International Society of Chief Data Officers. For more than 35 years, Peter has learned from working with hundreds of data management practices in 30 countries, including some of the world's most important. Among his 12 books are many firsts, starting before Google, before data was big, and before data science. Peter has founded several organizations that have helped more than 200 organizations leverage data-specific savings, have been measured at more than 1.5 billion US dollars. His latest is Anything Awesome. And if you would like to, if you have questions, by the way, for Sonia, feel free to put them in the Q&A panel, as she will be joining Peter in the Q&A at the end of the webinar today. So with that, let me turn everything over to Peter to get his presentation started. Peter, hello and welcome.
Hi, Shannon. Nice to be here for the 12th in our series this year. And Sonia, what a wonderful breath of fresh air to hear somebody talking from a data management perspective about AI. This is great, and I think it dovetails very nicely with what we're going to be talking about today. Shannon, vocal check okay?
Yeah, you sound good.
Yes.
Yep.
Thanks so much.
Sorry, I have to unmute myself. And it was right.
There you go. All right. Well, and Sonia, you're not the only person who's having some little technical difficulties today. So it must be just one of those things. You'd think it was Friday the 13th or something. But anyway, glad to have you with us. Yeah, today, really one of my favorite topics here, talking about sort of how we got to where we are and where we're headed from this perspective. So while the topic is data management best practices, and there are some. This is one of the things that's important to take away from this, that there are correct ways to do this and incorrect ways to do this. And certainly Sonia and I will talk a little bit more about them in the Q&A section as we get going. But what I also like to do is put a subtitle here, that practicing data management better. And what that means is that you have really this understanding of the vastness and the quality of data that spends an increasing role in everybody's life, and that hopefully everybody is motivated to increase their individual skills, because poor data skills cost you more, steal increasing amounts of your time, deliver less, and present greater risks to us as citizens, much less as part of organizations. Data management as a critical life skill that we need to have and understand its positive and negative applications on this. But there are defensive skills that we can look at and take advantage of the general pieces around this. I'd like to start out here by acknowledging the founder of our discipline, who is known as Lady Ada. Her full name is Augusta Ada King. She's a fascinating individual, only lived to the age of 42, unfortunately. But she looked at this weaving loom that you see on the screen here and said, wow, I understand that when the weaving loom becomes industrial strength, and this is really the one she was looking at, the Jacquard machine that was created in 1804, this thing that's hanging vertically on this looks a little bit like perhaps a computer card to some of you with enough gray hair on this. And that is exactly what she saw. She said, when they create a machine that can properly do the interpretation of this beyond just patterns on a weaving loom, I will be able to make it do mathematics. And this is her first, the world's very first computer program, where she's solving Bernoulli equations using a not yet invented device called the computer. The other thing, though, that she doesn't get enough credit for, and quite frankly, Gartner stole this, is something called the hype cycle. And her quote here from her writings was, in considering any new subject, there is a frequently to first overrate what we find to be already interesting and remarkable, and then by a second nature to undervalue the true state. Something new comes along and we go, wow, it's great, or whoa, it's terrible, right? And the correct answer is it's somewhere in the middle, and it takes some time to understand the overall of this within our organizations. Right now, there are many people who claim that AI is at the peak of inflated expectations and about to hit a trial of disillusionment. Those of you, again, with gray hair will understand this is an AI winter that they're forecasting. I certainly don't know what's going to happen, so I'm not going to make any prognostications on that. But it is useful to take a look at what Gartner has looked at for these hype cycles. Here is the data management hype cycle for 2022, and you can notice here something called data mesh that I've just circled in yellow, and that is headed for the top of the the peak of inflated expectations, but also already canceled out as far as Gartner is concerned. There's something called a data fabric that's headed for this trial of disillusionment. This was 2 years ago in 2022. And interestingly, master data management and data lakes are seen as up and coming things in that we've matured enough to understand where they play. Here's the 2023 cycle. Notice data mesh is still way up there. Data fabric is still falling. And once again, data lakes and master data are in fact still going up the slope of enlightenment around here. Here's the one for 2024. Again, just a quick note, vector databases, data products are now headed for the top. Their data mesh has already fallen over the top, and data ops and data fabric are on their way down. Again, metadata management solutions are on their way up. And of course, we have our data lake, master data management grouping right over here. This is to say that it is possible to figure out where your data management technologies are in fact going. So we're going to look today at a little bit of motivation because we're unsatisfied with the current state. And quite frankly, we're having trouble making progress in general. There are many pockets of excellence out there, and the conference that Shannon is referencing this week, I was there for just a short while, but did see enough things that were there that it's wonderful to see that there is some good progress, but these are people who are interested in participating. Then we're going to move into a quick section on how did we get here that has some origins in DoD and the Software Engineering Institute. We'll talk a little bit about those. It's built on proven research, and this leads us to the industry push for best practices. Then we'll talk about the ingredients that you need to have as part of your data management improvement program, one of them being the data maturity model, the other being the data management body of knowledge. And I have to say this, at least today, because our lawyer sent us a letter. We now finally have a copyright on this, and it's called the DAMA Data Management Book of Knowledge. And I'll have to go back and put our trademark in there, which is something to celebrate in this. The question, of course, looking at these two is to understand and apply them together. And one of the key pieces to understand is that they are joined together by a weak link in the chain architecture. We'll do just a bit on strategy with talking about the importance of understanding the architectural support provided by at least a three-legged stool. And we'll finish off by talking about how one gets to Carnegie Hall. Now, Shannon and I are both musicians, so we'll understand that particular reference, but hopefully everybody else will by the time we get there in about 50 minutes on this. Notice over on the side, too, I have 1 + 1 = 11. And that really is the kind of synergy that Sonia was talking about when applied correctly that you can obtain from your data as an asset in there. We'll be inviting her back for the Q&A session and going to jump right into these measures of unproductivity. Right now, your knowledge workers in your organization are the best source of untapped productivity improvements that we have out there. 33% of their time is spent recreating knowledge that already exists, and only 10% of their time is spent creating new knowledge and content. That's a really horrible situation, and 53% would rather do household chores or pay household bills than use content management repositories, metadata repositories, et cetera, et cetera. 74%, 3/4 of them feel unhappy or overwhelmed when working with data, and 1/3 of them spend at least 1 hour a week procrastinating over data-related tasks. A couple more measurements up here. Again, everybody has a good understanding of how to use data at the 14% level. In other words, only 14% of our citizenry, which applies directly to knowledge workers, have a good understanding of how to use business data. And of the generation that is becoming part of the workforce now, 1 in 5 of them classify themselves as data literate. So future employees are underprepared for data-driven workforces, and this is something that we've got to fix. But more importantly, business decision makers have a whole series of oopsies here as well. 24% of them feel fully confident. Whoops, I'm so sorry. I'm going to go back. Make sure I give the point on that. There we go. Again, 24% of them feel fully confident in their ability to read, write, work with, and argue with data. That is the definition of data literacy that everybody has been using for a while. 1 in 3 are able to make measurable value from this. 27% say that their analytics products produce actionable insights, and 80% of them, when I'm sitting around a table with executives, I can look them straight in the face and say that 4 out of 5 of you would pay me under the table to make you more data literate. Why don't we bring all our cards up on the table and all do it together? One last set of measurements here, just real quickly, which is that too many organizations are simply trying to improve the quality of their data without improving their data processing ability on the part of their knowledge workers. Again, when asked to make decisions about data, even though we might have good quality data, 52% of them incorporate it into their decision making, and 48% of them defer to their gut. That is not a good number, of course. And it gets even worse when we go to the C-suite. 2/3 of them go to their gut. 1 in 3, in fact, incorporate data. These are numbers from the Data Literacy Project, which is a really wonderful set of very valid, scientifically correct and research that they've done here. 1 in 3 of these people say they will find an alternate method of completing the task without using the data. I don't know what that means, maybe a Ouija board or something. And 14% ignore the task entirely. And so we have questions that people ask. Why hasn't my data warehouse, lakehouse, why hasn't my technology, why haven't hiring a CDO, why hasn't purchasing Salesforce, why hasn't moving to a cloud improved my data capabilities? And just to put a little icing on the cake, the number one complaint that CEOs have from an expense perspective is, why are my cloud bills so enormous at this point? And I'm going to zero in on that for just a quick section, because of course I think everybody has had some experience in this area. When you put data in the cloud, I have 3 rules. It should be cleaner, it should be smaller, and it should be more shareable by definition in there. What does that mean? Well, let's take a look. What happens in most cases here, and I'm using warehousing, but I'm going to switch the example in midstream to cloud because it is the same lesson. We take the data and we forklift the data into the cloud. The problem with forklifting is that there's no basis for decisions made, no inclusion of architectural engineering concepts, and no idea that these concepts are missing from the process, notwithstanding the fact that 80% of all organizational data is redundant, obsolete, or trivial, or rot. Now, the only argument I ever get with that is that it's more than that in our organization. So what should be happening here, of course, is that the move to the cloud or the data warehouse should be a transformational activity. And that transformation should result in data that is smaller in volume, that is cleaner, and that is more shareable in order to do that. And that's the same rule for cloud as well. But of course, if you don't do that, you'll end up paying a lot of money and your CEO will yell at you for what's going on. This also gives us an opportunity for branding data so that you can say that data in the cloud is of known quality, perhaps, and the data that's not in the cloud is not, because it's not easy to visualize the cost of data debt. It slows progress, it decreases quality, it increases the costs that are there, and of course presents greater risks to the organization. The next book that I'm going to put out, number 14, will be in fact called Managing Data Debt, with my friend and colleague John Ladley on this. So success requires a 3-legged stool of people, process, and technology in order to do this. And yet we're not learning this lesson. When we look at what's going on, once again, a wonderful series of surveys from a fellow named Randy Bean and Tom Davenport. Here's the URL here for you to go off and look at this yourself. They've done a great job over the years. And in 2023, we had a very interesting set. This was the first time any of these measures in 7 years had shown over 50%. So in 2023, 60% said they were driving innovation with data, 41% competing on data and analytics, managing data as a creative business asset. 1 in 4 organizations were creating a data-driven organization, and 1 in 5 were supporting a data-driven culture. These were the 2023 numbers. The 2024 numbers are much better, interestingly. Now, remember, these are all self-reported, so I am quite frankly skeptical that we have made, in fact, this much improvement within a single year's time, but nevertheless, self-reporting does give us some numbers, and you can see still the majority of companies are having trouble with it. But the most important numbers that have come from their surveys repeatedly over the years are these. We've asked the question, is your problems, the challenges that you're having in this area, primarily technology related or people and process related? In 2018, you can see it was 80-20. In 2019, in 2020, in 2021, in 2022, in 2023, and last year, including. These are still highly focused on people and process-oriented problems as opposed to technology problems. So 80% minimally in these are going to be people and process. And just as a note, data governance is the only resource that you have in your organization that is going to be able to focus in on these activities. One of the real problems in this area is that everybody else is trying to do data. So we have everything else data, and you've got data governance and data management, perhaps some other activities. And this is, of course, what people hear. They do not appreciate or understand the difference between all of this. So just call it a data program. All right, so how did we get here? Let's dive in here. And again, the motivation here, I love the Alice in Wonderland motif here. We want to move our data management program to the next level is a question that I get very often here in my career, and it's a reasonable request. But the first question back to them is, what level are you at now? Because if you're currently managing your data, but you can't measure it, how are you going to manage it effectively? How do you know where to put the time and money in a way that best supports the vision? And this was a question that I was asked to work on when I was the U.S. Department of Defense Reverse Engineering Program Manager back in the late 80s, early 90s. And we sponsored some research at the Carnegie Mellon Institute for Software Engineering, asking how can we measure the performance of DoD and our partners. And we were told, go check out what the Navy is up to, but also pay us some money. And they did come up with an integrated process and data improvement approach program. But my COTAR at DoD required the SEI to remove the data portion of the approach. It was given to me later on because nobody else seemed to want it, and I was able to grow it into the CMMI, DM BoK, et cetera, et cetera. The publication that was resulting from this was a internal research and development project at the MITRE Corporation by our departed friend Bert Parker here, as well as a couple of other good colleagues that we worked on. And we discovered that there were some key areas that we could measure in data management that gave us a approach and a normative model for data management so that we understood the scope of what was required in there and could organize the key practices. That area was picked up on by a woman named Melanie Mecca, who is living down in Florida and still with us, working with a company called DataWise. I encourage you to reach out to her and tell her you heard about her. But she is the former director of the CMMI, and quite frankly, they really never understood the data part of it. They've mainly focused the CMMI on the software aspects of what's been going on there. But Melanie is a great friend and deserves a lot of credit for putting together the final version of this, which was the data management maturity model released back almost 10 years ago at this point. Lots of good work that went into it. The structures gave us specific practice statements and more than 600 work products that are in there. The document is still out there. You can get a hold of it. Again, each structure area was divided up into a purpose, notes, goals of the process area, core questions around it, functional practices, example work products. Again, just a wonderful piece of work emphasizing what you in your organization are actually doing, behavioral type activities, activities that produce work products, and coming up with a practical focus that allow people to check on this. When you go back and look over time, the CMMI has a better result than ITEL, RUP, COBID, and PMI. All of these others produce less good results, with percentage of projects on budget being higher with CMMI and higher for projects on time. Again, these other approaches are good, but these are much better. When I'm asked about measuring organizations, assessing them, and things like that, I refer them to a quote in our data literacy book that Todd and I wrote. While all improvement programs begin with an obligatory assessment phase, CMMI and DMM are the only proven frameworks that have added literally decades of measurement and practice to these things, and using others results in potentially using unproven methods and certainly not the ability to compare and contrast across different things. I got shown at one point in time Somebody brought me in and said, hey, company X has used the data management maturity process. I said, there is no data management maturity process, but sure enough, this consultant had written DAMA all over things in hopes that it would sell people to do this. Now, I flipped from 2014 to 2019, where interestingly enough, the government passed something called the FEPA Act. It's the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking. It's a really good piece of legislation. It requires the use of open models and open data in policy evaluations. That means if the education department said at some point in time that they would like to change school type from school type X to school type Y, they have to tell us in advance what model they're going to use to evaluate it and what open data sets that they're going to do so. And failure to do so results in penalties that are higher than HIPAA around this. So it's a very interesting and toothy kind of place. By the way, did you all read that? I just ran it by very quickly in there. It also mandates that all federal data is open by default. So organizations now have to protect by exception rather than by default, and that non-political CDOs are required in each federal agency, mandating in this case the use of best practices, a glossary, a dictionary, term bank of some sort, and a professional class of data management people. And as I said before, the penalties are higher than HIPAA. I don't think anybody's been prosecuted just yet, but it is necessary to understand that if 1/3 of our economy is controlled by the federal government does this, it's probably a good idea for the private sector to adopt it as well. In addition, in parallel, in everything that we've talked about so far, we used to look at books such as this one, which was a very difficult to find academic text, the Handbook on Data Management and Information Systems. Again, wonderful book. We evolved it into the DAMA BoK, the Data Management Body of Knowledge in here, and now we've replaced that with the version R. That's version 2. If you're hearing about it for the first time, shame on us for not telling you about it earlier, but it is important to understand that these two pieces, the data management maturity model and the DAMA DM BoK, covering these 11 practice areas, really do make up the best practices that we're talking about when one is doing data management. Moving right on still further, understanding and applying them together. And just a quick note that this is where I'm speaking to you all from. This is my house in rural Virginia, where I don't yet have internet. I have essentially twisted pair wire. If you remember DSL, that's what I'm calling to you on. And you might say, goodness, what could somebody who lives out in the country tell us about these things? Well, first of all, what you're seeing here is an artifact of the fact that I am a horse husband, and that meant building a barn was part of my process of engaging my spouse to this venture that we have out here in the countryside. And the barn required a loan from the bank, and the bank gave us exactly this much money to build. In other words, I could build the foundation, and they said, before you do anything else, you will get a foundation inspection, because if you don't get the foundation inspection, you're not getting the next tranche of money. I hope you agree that this makes good business sense. Building a good quality barn on top of a poor foundation means that 10 years later in 2024, the barn might not be in as good a shape as it is in. We've been through hurricanes and tornadoes and everything since out there, and there is no IT equivalent of this, unfortunately. That means that we have many, many organizations that are trying to build things on top of poor foundations. And Sonia gave a good example of that, talking about AI. Once again, if you see me driving around Washington or Richmond, you'll see my car is red and it has the license plate GIGO, standing for garbage in, garbage out. Now, I'm going to move from there to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Why, you might ask? Well, first of all, let's explain it to those of you that don't remember it from high school, although I do find that most of you do. Maslow was the one that said, look, we have food, need, clothing, and shelter needs, and if they are not met, we will not be able to be safe. And if we're not able to be safe, we'll never be part of something that is bigger than us, whether it's a family or an organization, a cult, whatever it is we're going to get into. And if we don't have that understanding of ourselves versus the larger organization, it's impossible to know whether we have self-esteem, finally getting onwards up to self-actualization. The TED people hijack this concept of self-actualization and call it flow. It's the same concept. You're working at your highest and best use. And yet, when we look at data, there's a parallel concept. What you see up here, of course, are technologies, AI, ML, crypto, mesh, right? We've already seen that mesh is not long for the world, at least according to Gartner on this, and that those things are good, but not sufficient. You need a much more than just the tip of the iceberg that everybody sees. You need foundational data practices in order to make your data management efforts truly pay off. And these represent capabilities for the organization as opposed to technologies. And yet, in spite of this, I'm asked oftentimes, I understand all that, Peter, but can you do it faster? And the answer is yes, I can do it faster, but if I do it faster, it will take longer. If I do it faster, it will cost more. If I do it faster, it will deliver less. And if I do it faster, it will present greater risks to your organization. So we've talked about these 5 areas. If you watch carefully, they will dance across your screen up into these 5 blobs. This is back to the DMM that we have on here. And all of these are part of doing data management well. Again, we have to manage the data coherently. We have to manage the assets professionally. We have a data management lifecycle that we need to understand. We have understanding of the need to figure out what is fit for purpose. I had somebody ask me in my session yesterday at the conference, when is data quality done? And the answer is, of course, probably never, but you can certainly accomplish a lot by putting in a concentrated effort. But on the other hand, you're going to need to associate in your management's understanding that this need for data management, including data quality, is going to continue in your organization as long as you need an HR department. And at the time you don't need an HR department, then you can also get rid of your data management activities. The last one of these is you need to have all of this done, of course, with the right data architecture implementation in order to do this. All of these can be practiced with different supporting levels, supporting processes. But what we really want to do is look at the formulation that came out of the Software Engineering Institute, the Data Management Maturity Model. And that is key, as I mentioned before, to understand that this is having to do with the weakest link in the chain. A chain can only be as strong as the weakest link in it, particularly if you are hanging something from the chain. There was a very sad engineering failure for a Hyatt in Kansas City many years ago, where the engineers had forgotten this particular rule and people died. I think it was dozens of people were killed as a result of this. Now, the point here is you have to first understand the actual structure of this. So every practice in the world gets a 1 point for having a pulse. It's kind of a low standard, but nevertheless, that is what we give it when we're evaluating data management maturity. If the area that you're looking at has the ability to have some repetition. For example, we could say Sonia might be the person who is the best qualified to do this, so let's give that task to Sonia. While that may not be a good practice from a maturity perspective, it may be an effective practice because, of course, Sonia is excellent at what she does in that context that is there. If Sonia has written down any of this information, defined it, in other words, that organizational practice area would receive a 3. And if any of the things that are written down are measured, then we would receive a 4, and 5 becomes available to organizations that use the measurements to go back and improve the existing processes. I'll just say it real briefly 1 second time to make sure that you follow. You get 1 point for having a pulse. You get 2 points if your process is repeatable. You get 3 points if your process is documented. You get 4 points if your process is measurable and measured, and 5 points if it is optimized by using all of the things that we've done together. This is a wonderful way of describing almost any practice maturity, and again belongs to the Software Engineering Institute. We've adapted it, of course, over time to these data areas, which means we can now start to look, and I'm assigning 3 to data governance, data quality, data operations, and data platforms in there. They are level 3. So notice I turned them all gold. Well, guess what? This organization in question just doesn't have a data management strategy. Therefore, the overall maturity of the organization can only be a 1. It's not an average of 4 3s and a 1. It is a 1. It is the weakest link in the chain that gives us the ability to do this. Now I've given you the assessment components, the data management practice areas, and the capability maturity model levels that show up in here in order to do this. And from that kind of a process, we can measure what's going on within more detail at our programs. These are just some samples from the DM BoK. We can also look at what our organization's scoring in general. And I'll show you some very specific examples here. But we can now start to say the insurance industry, for example, may be more mature than the manufacturing industry. I'm making those up. That is not a valid research piece. The assessments, however, are generally not worth a lot of money to discover. You're at the beginning of your journey, but you can use them to uncover pockets of unknown excellence, previously unknown excellence in there. And that the first plan should be to examine the feasibility of expanding these to other parts of the organization. When we look at this from these perspectives, we can now see that we can do the industry-focused results that I was telling you before. And this is actual results from a survey that we, from the results that we collected early on in here through a series of surveys in here. And again, this was insurance areas, and the insurance industry at the time did not score very highly in this area. So that shows that most of the insurance industries were between a 1 and a 2 on this. This was the average of the averages. Remember, your actual score can only be a whole number, a whole integer, in order to come up with these things. We can also use this to look at a very specific opportunity within an area. This was a airline, in fact, if I recall. Yes, an airline that we were comparing in here. And we did the first set of comparisons in here, 1, 2 2s, and 1. And management is, sort of confused as to why they would even spend any money to understand this until I showed them that their industry competition was far outperforming them. And in this case, they got down very quickly and said there are clearly some areas of all opportunity that we can look at and specific challenges that we have to do. Remember, we have to get all 3, the data management program, the organizational integration, the data support operations, up to a level 2 before the organization as a whole can perform at level 2. One final quick example here. This is one that we did and published from the World Bank, which was very nice results in here. We were asked to evaluate their treasury function, their information systems group, and the work areas of the business, the part that delivered the checks to people. So this was the results for the treasury. They were a flat 1. So was the information systems group. They were also a flat 1. But the World Bank's business practices were actually world class in order to do this. They were the highest scoring and still are some of the highest scoring areas that we've ever looked at when we look at these assessments over time in here. Once again, we can add in some industry benchmarks and overall benchmarks, and you can see once again they are outperforming the industry and the overall benchmarks in those areas in data governance. So quite a very nice success story. And yet we've looked at these results over time, and these are some average of averages, so take them with their worth. But the idea that we've gone from 2007 to 2019, which was the essentially the era of big data, is a really horrendous set of statistics in that we are statistically insignificant. They are unchanged in order to do this. And that is a horrible, horrible thing. In fact, we can go even further when we look at literacy around this. We used to call this the National Association of American Adult Literacy. And that has now been renamed to the Program for International Assessment of Adult Competencies. Regardless of what it's called, it's still not giving us good results. Once again, during the era of big data, we have statistically unchanged results, and these are terrible numbers to do this. Now, I'm going to switch here and talk about strategy for just a few minutes because, of course, when you understand where you are, you now need to figure out how you're going to get to where you want to be. And most people use a very different definition of strategy, but the one I like to use is one that comes from the military, which invented the term strategy. And that is a pattern in a stream of decisions. And this pattern guides work group activities. Work groups are much able to figure out themselves what should we collectively be working on, because of course they huddle together as they're looking at things. And the overall pattern for doing strategy in this case becomes a cyclical, repetitive, improvable process that we're going to call based on the theory of constraints. And the theory of constraints is a well-known theory exemplified by a book that some of you may remember called The Goal. Now, the process is to identify the constraints that are imposing limitation on the system, as in what are the ones and what are the threes in my organization, and how can I turn the ones into threes, and to exploit that constraint, make quick improvements in the constraint, trying to fix it using existing resources. If that is unsuccessful, we move on to the next level, which is to subordinate all non-constraints. We have to make everything else less important than fixing the problem. We have to alleviate that constraint up into an area that will make it super useful and repeat that process until the constraint is eliminated. If I think I said eliminated. I think that the part that I like most is that this should look an awful lot like Plan, Do, Check, Act. Some of you are very familiar with it, and the older I've gotten, the more all methods seem to accrue to Plan, Do, Check, Act in there. I just think Deming really hit it on the head in that sense. So let's give a couple of quick examples of strategy. If the good guys are on the left and the bad guys are on the right, we're going to use one set of strategic approaches. If the good guys are up here on a hill and the bad guys are down on the bottom, we're going to use a different approach, as we are also going to use a different approach if the good guys are down here at the bottom of the hill, the bad guys are up there at the top. So strategy is not something that should be static and unremitted. It should be adaptive to do this. And the best articulation of this was one of our former presidents, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, where he said, "In preparing for battle, I've always found that plans are useless, but planning is indispensable." And that planning process is absolutely critical to be able to have that in there, because if we don't have that ability to do critical planning in there and to adapt on time, it's going to be extremely difficult to actually come up with things that are useful around that. So let's take it a little bit further. I like to talk about something called a data sandwich. Again, it's the idea that three things are going to be critically important for our data management practices area, and they are data literacy of our organizations, and it's critical to make sure that you start your data literacy initiatives by educating your decision makers, because your decision makers oftentimes do not know when they are making data decisions. So that's why it's the first place you have to start with data literacy. Eventually, all of your knowledge workers need to do it. And that means that the purview of the CDO is, in fact, to look out across the entire organization and raise the data literacy of the entire organization. The second area in there is your data supply, which unfortunately tends to be somewhat uneven. And then, of course, your use for standards in the middle there, which is also, again, in most organizations, kind of uneven. So our goal with respect to improving these data management practices is to make the data literacy, the data supply, more robust and standard data, so that we can take all three of these activities and have them work together in concrete. And while that's a great thing to say, I also had to go to India, to this tea farm that I was visiting a couple of years back, and saw this sign hanging over the cash register, which, once again, those of you that are Deming aficionados will know that this is a Deming quote: "Quality engineering and architecture work products do not happen accidentally." I asked the gentleman who was running the cash register, "Why do you have that sign over the cash register?" And he looked at me like I was an idiot, said, "How could you have well-designed practices otherwise if you don't put time and effort into them?" And of course, I was sufficiently put in my place and again, had a wonderful trip. But of course, also we need to add the word data into all of these things in order to make it work. Quality data engineering and architecture products do not happen accidentally. And we need, in fact, to have these set up so that they will work on a regular basis for things in practice. So we're back to our DM BoK now. We started that out about 20 minutes ago. The now copyrighted name of DM BoK here is really, most people look at it and say, okay, well, which one of these 11 areas should I start with? And it certainly seems that data governance might be a good place to start because it is centrally located. But I'm going to give you a little scenario here and remind you, of course, of our three-legged stool metaphor around this, and say that, in fact, most organizations, when they approach this process, actually have to do a combination of these. And just like the three bears, you don't want too much and you don't want too little. One's probably enough and 10 is probably too many. So here's an example. Somebody who's putting together a data warehouse and a business intelligence project of some sort, perhaps in the cloud even, might look at this and say, I'm going to do some data warehousing, but I also understand that by putting in good quality data to that data warehouse, I'm more likely to achieve good results earlier in the process. And in order to get that, I'm going to need to put in place some governance. So we're going to put data governance in place so that we can make that actually work as a practice. Each of these, you get one experience point for doing each of these things, but now I'm going to come back and say we've gone a little further in our journey and now have a better idea where we're still going to do some more data warehousing, but now we've decided that we need to focus somewhat on metadata management here. If you're not familiar with it, that's data about data, and gosh, that's how you get quality and things like that in place. So it's a combination of things that we've been doing to get to that level. We've gotten 2 experience points in some of those areas and 1 in metadata management. Now we're going to go our 3rd iteration on this, where we've now got 3 experience points in data warehouse and data governance, but now we've discovered that metadata management is in fact the best place to put and finish off our project with. So the combination of the 2 of these is making sure that you are at a certain level of maturity in those 4 areas that I've described earlier on, and can now describe this, sorry, 4, it's 5 actually, in order to describe this quality, metadata management and reference need to be at a good level, and data warehousing have to be a little bit better, as well as you've learned some things around data governance. So how do you pick your first project in data management now that you have a new understanding of how it should be put together? Well, I use this lighthouse metaphor here. There are some things that will further organizational strategy. You're, of course, looking for data things that will help support the use of data in the organization achieving strategy, but that's a big universe of things. So let's put another Venn diagram component up there, which is the data is in use to the business, and some of that data may not be in as good a quality as you'd like it to be, data that is not yet fit for purpose. This is a good overlap, and the overlap between the 2 provides us a good focus. But let's add one more piece to that, which is that your organization may be practicing certain data management skills. And the intersection of all 3 of those is really the sweet spot for where you should start out in those project areas. They're relatively easy to identify when you use all 3 of these criteria, and the organization can in fact benefit around that particular process. Now, the next question, and it's almost our final one, is how does one in fact get to Carnegie Hall? I mentioned before, Shannon and I are both musicians. Neither of us, of course, have played Carnegie Hall, but I've at least been a number of times, and we can ask Shannon later on if she's ever been. I'd be really surprised if she hadn't in order to do that. But of course, the famous joke is, how does one get to Carnegie Hall? And the answer is, of course, practice, practice, practice. And that's what data management is largely about. You have to have good music. Okay, so the thing that you're trying to do in there, and just a quick side note on all this, but the Bee Gees song "Stayin' Alive" was the song I hated more than any other song in 1977, the year I graduated from high school, because disco had replaced my beloved rock and roll, and we didn't have a band for our prom. We had a DJ that was there. Being a musician, I wanted the live music. But once again, having a good song isn't the only thing that happens. And one of my wonderful surprises as I've gotten older here was to discover that Staying Alive is actually quite a good song. In fact, if you look on YouTube, you will find that Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band decided to play that song for the Australians when they went on their last Australian tour most recently. It's a wonderful, wonderful piece of music in there, and I will always be reminded of the fact that disco is a style of music, and that therefore the song is not necessarily bad just because it's played in a disco style. In fact, my beloved Grateful Dead played a lot of disco songs for a while too, and had a little bit of fun with that all the way around. So we've spent some time talking about motivation. We're unsatisfied with our current state of things. And let's remember the people at the conference, the people who are paying attention to these webinars, are people who are really interested in this. Most of the rest of the world has not gotten the joke yet. And so we have an awful lot of more work that we need to do in order to get people on board. This is the mission of DAMA International and has been my personal motivation for quests all the way around here. We're going to now look at where to next, right? Well, the first thing to understand is that change management and leadership are critical components to this. We can't get people to change the way they do things unless we actively work at it. There's a key to understanding how to do change management that I was taught a while back. Now, remember, this is a little metaphor that we're going to have to teach our young people what it was a physical key, because of course they're going to be used to electronic locks at this point. And how does one unlock the key? Well, the key here is to understand that only when all 5 of these things line up at once will it in fact work. When I visit an organization, I will often see vision, skills, incentive, and an action plan, and I'll see frustration. And the reason I'll see frustration is because the group has not the right level of resources. Similarly, when I visit groups, I will often see vision, incentive, resources, and an action plan, and I'll see anxiety because they don't have the skills. A wonderful diagnostic tool. I wish I could claim I had invented it, but it belongs to a woman named Mary Lippert, who created it in the late 80s. Again, if I see skills, incentive, resources, and an action plan, I will see confusion because there is no vision. If I see vision, skills, resources, and an action plan, but no incentive, I will see gradual change. And if I see vision, skills, incentive, resources, but no action plan, I'll see false starts. Only when all 5 of these things are in place does the organization actually get change. And culture is the biggest impediment to shifting our thinking about data. There's just much that we need to do in order to get this. I have a case study that's out there. It doesn't require any download. Sorry, you have to download it. It doesn't require any registration to download if you want to read more around that particular piece. So from a data perspective, I like to think of 4 basic data truths that we need to have. And that is that data volume is still increasing faster than we are able to process it. The data interchange, overhead, and other costs of poor data management practices are measurably sapping organizational and individual resources and therefore productivity. That reliance on technology-based approach and technology-based education methods has not materially addressed the gap between creation and processing or reduced bottom line costs. And finally, there is, of course, an industry who's designed to, in fact, make us more dependent on them in regards of using data for trying to make money off of it. This requires us to have a very strong paradigm shift. Process is more important than results at first. Learning how to play any instrument at all, you will get the feel for that instrument, and therefore learning individual songs, individual pieces of music will become much easier as a result. That failure itself is a lesson, and that it's important to take stand of these things, but to also learn from other people's failures, because you don't have to experience the failure in order to learn from the failure in that case. And that the people and process aspects of data management are receiving insufficient attention around all of these, just the same way as I would say that from the AI perspective, many people are focusing on the algorithms. And as Sonia said before, not enough are focusing on the data, but that these best practices do in fact exist. And now that you're aware of them, you can start to implement them in your own organization and for your own benefit. in order to do this. So again, let's just go back over this. We're unsatisfied with the current state. We're not really making progress as a society, but that there is a proven research basis that started out with the Defense Department, incorporated parts of the Software Engineering Institute and MITRE Corporation's research projects, as well as some of our own efforts in here that produced this result from the CMMI that gave us the data management maturity model. The industry has a push and, in fact, a law, a legal obligation to use best practices, especially if you're in the federal government. But why would you use anything less? Now, many people don't know that they exist. Now, of course, you do. And that the ingredients for this are the data management maturity model with its step function for increasing and improving data around here, and that only by understanding them and the now copyrighted, literally just happened today, now copyrighted data management body of knowledge and applying them together, you'll be able to understand this weakest link in the chain architecture that points to where you need to fix things and put on, and that use strategy to guide that process to figure out exactly what you should do, because it is a three-legged stool. We can't do things without people, process, and technologies. And the opportunity to do all of them is right in front of us every day. That only by practicing these areas, by putting a dedicated team in place and using this dedicated team to start getting better about things. This is why data management practices should be centralized in organizations, especially at first. Eventually, you may decide to split it out and do some things. I've had some organizations that have had as many as 3 data management practices working at the same time on this in a coordinated fashion, but it is possible to do this, but only after you've gotten one to work. You certainly don't want to start 3 separate initiatives at any one particular point in time. That really getting the key to this, of course, is to understand that these practices have to go in and focus in on the things we talked about: lack of focus on people and process areas, overemphasis on technologies, and all the rest of that. And we're coming right back to the top, and it's almost time to invite Sonia back in, but we want to invite you to join us on our 14th year, Shannon, that we're starting in January on this. It's been a long, wonderful association, and I am so appreciative of your guidance and support in this area around this. So let's invite Sonia back in and see what sort of questions everybody has.
Peter, thank you as always for another great presentation. And if you have questions for Peter or for Sonia, feel free to put them in the Q&A panel of your screen. And just to answer the most commonly asked questions, just a reminder, I will send a follow-up email to all registrants by end of day Thursday for this webinar with links to the slides and links to the recording, along with anything else requested throughout. So diving in here, I thought that data management maturity models include siloed level, department-wide maturity level at level 3, and enterprise-wide maturity at level 4. Is that important?
Well, I've seen lots of variations on it. I would say that because the need to be centralized in there as opposed to department, yes, you can, in fact, measure them down at a lower level. However, let's think about it, an example of AI, for example. If you have a department that is performing with a high level of data management maturity, and you're trying to do something based on AI, one of the first things that the data scientists who are involved in the AI are going to do is say, hey, this could be really cool if we could incorporate this other part of data. And maybe that other part of data is from an organization component that has not gotten the discipline in place, and in fact, becomes a weak link in the chain in your AI system. Sonia, do you want to comment on that as well? Oh, did we lose her mic, Shannon?
I see you just unmuted. Are you there, Sonia? Oh, for some reason, we're not getting your audio now.
I would hate to speak for Sonia. She's certainly more expert in the AI pieces, but I wanted to use that as an example since she was.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yay.
Okay,
Sure.
sorry about that. I
problem.
kind of lost my train of thought there. So thank you for inviting me. But no, I think we're good with your answer.
Super.
Awesome. And again, I invite people to put questions in the Q&A panel, but there was one that came into the chat earlier, parking lot
For
item
Sonia, I
question,
think. Yeah.
yeah. So, how would you approach creating data for a chatbot supporting user access and usage of public websites, Washington State Department of Health? Is there an AI bot that surfs the sites and creates metadata for the website chatbot?
Oh my goodness, that sounds like one of my students, Sonia, who's trying to ask you that question, who's supposed to be working on their independent study project. See, we're doing this. Everybody's doing all these things, right? Anyway, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's different factors that need to be considered here with using public data, right? I think that you have to understand if the public data is okay to be used as part of your chatbot, right? If you want to include it. You do also have to be conscious about if there's any sensitivity with any of the data that you're using and leveraging as part of your chatbot. That's always something that, at least from an IBM perspective, we're also very conscious of, and we talk to our customers about. And then you also have to be conscious about the results that it gives you because of that, right? One of the biggest things that we actually discuss with a lot of our clients is the use of public data versus enterprise data. So I am kind of spinning it back to the business side of things, but majority of models and in AI, most of it is leveraging public data. And it's great because it gives you some, results, but just keep in mind those results are public, they're very general. It's not specific to maybe the area that you're focused on. And one of the things that we always recommend is that, at least with the clients that we're working with, is that we could try to help some of our clients focus on leveraging some of their own data, right? So that the results are more custom and very specific to what they care about. So you do have to keep all these factors in mind when you're doing such a thing.
And Sonia, let me push a little further onto this. The chatbots tend to be public facing. So does that have an additional urgency that's not clearly an internal product, but the customers are going to be looking at this and getting the results?
Okay, I'm sorry, can you guys still hear me?
We can now.
Sure can.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. I'm not sure what's going on with my audio today. I'm sorry, can you repeat that again?
Sure. The chatbots tend to be publicly facing, and are there additional considerations? I think that may be one of the parts of the question that the questioner was sort of easing towards. It's one thing to set up something that you're going to internally use and
Right.
be useful for all sorts of things, but that better still, if we've got this thing facing externally, do you think there's additional considerations that need to have that sort of an approach?
Yeah, I mean, you have to definitely still think about that, right? Like you want to make sure that there's some guardrails around the data, even if it is going to be used externally, because there might be, it depends what data you're using, right? And there might be some information in there that you just don't want to put out there, or maybe it's not appropriate, right? Even if it is external, you do still have to be conscious of that, and having the right guardrails in place for the data that you're using for your chatbots is definitely a critical step in this process.
Super. I have seen both good and bad versions of chatbots out there, and one of the ones that I thought was really good was MailChimp. I don't necessarily have a sweet heart in my spot, a sweet spot in my heart for Intuit since they bought MailChimp, but before they bought them, I was able to do quite a bit of really good work diagnosing things. Also, Amazon, if you go to their returns page, has done quite a bit of really pretty good AI-based work around their chatbot and having customer service pieces that are there. So if you want to see a good example of those would be two I'd recommend. But I think the real question was, as a component of using this, how is data management related to the development of these chatbots? And of course, one of the things we talk about is the RAG approach, which is going in and grabbing and essentially training these things in there. Is there an aspect of that also you think is worth highlighting here?
Yeah, absolutely. We're actually I'm actually very deep in the weeds of this piece of work right now. RAG is the top, I would say, use case right now, at least when it comes back to data management and the dependency that it has. It also introduces different technologies. Primarily, one of the ones that we've been working with our clients on is the vector database, which you had it on your hype cycle, right? So I think
Yeah.
well, that's one example, right, where we're seeing a lot of clients really very interested in leveraging. You can use like diverse and different types of databases to help you with this that have vector technologies. But in our case, for example, we have been looking into leveraging specifically a vector database because of performance and also because of the different functionalities that it gives you. And one of the key aspects that you do still need to think about that a lot of folks forget about is that even though you're doing RAG and you're taking data, unstructured data, you're embedding it, and then you're storing it into this kind of embedding models into a vector database, you still have to think about the fact that access control is very key. Because if you are just storing it there and you're making it available to everyone and not really thinking about who has access to it, you might create some risk. So I think that's one best practice that I would say that you have to consider is access control, and authorization is still very much a key piece of any RAG use case. And when you're thinking about data management and its dependency on it.
Super. Thanks for diving into that a little bit. Next question, Shannon.
Yeah, I love all these questions, so feel free to keep them coming in the Q&A panel there. Do any of the maturity models include a measure of culture, and how can we measure culture?
Excellent question. I certainly have experienced good culture and culture that has not been supportive of organizations, but I am not aware of anybody that has a measure of culture. Perhaps somebody in our audience can volunteer to look at that, or point us in a direction where we can learn something new about it. Maybe that's the answer. Something is that it's binary. For example, one of the stories I love to tell is that I went into the U.S. Army as a client to help them learn about data governance, and their culture was extremely helpful because as far as the Army is concerned, everything is governed. And when they found out that data was not governed, that was a problem for them, and they wanted to fix it really quickly. Again, other organizations, it's not going to be the same kind of result. Is it really just a harmful effect or a supportive effect, or is there perhaps a more nuance that needs to be measured in more detail?
Yeah, I agree with you. We see the same from an IBM standpoint when we're working with different types of customers. So we do tend to see that financial and like public sector, I guess, government as well, which US Army would fall under. They seem to be definitely a lot stricter with the guardrails that they want around their data, and data governance is very much embedded into their DNA when it comes to how they manage data and just their technology in general. But because of that, the expectations and the criteria of what data needs to go through in order to provide the right level of access, the standards are a lot higher. And as technology changes, that continues to evolve, right? So I think I totally agree with you, because then when we compare it to perhaps other industries, they might not necessarily have the same rigor. Like, for example, a lot of the customers maybe are more open to moving their data on the cloud just because they don't have the same rigor, as opposed to some customers that maybe they have those very strict regulations, and maybe they're very strict in terms of location and geography, and they might decide to keep their data on-prem just to make sure that they respect those regulations, and be able to still execute successfully, right, when it comes to data management.
Thanks for that.
Perfect. Thank you. That is currently the only questions that we have. But let me here just surf the chat just a second here, and feel free to keep the questions coming, because come on, y'all, I have been away from hosting for a little bit and I want to hang out with y'all a little bit longer.
That's right.
I've missed it.
I think everybody's probably at your conference, Shannon. Maybe that's the key.
No, I'm so excited that I saw a lot of people on here that I haven't seen in a while, and I'm trying to get to a comment here, but Zoom is not letting me. Okay, so shouldn't it be a byproduct of the maturity level if it's initial? Clearly, the cultural aspect isn't there yet. So continuing in on that point.
So that's an excellent point, right? Obviously, organizations that are less mature will not have had a chance to develop whatever a data culture is. And I say whatever, I've got a book on data literacy, so I sort of address it in there, but it's not an area that I'll confess to having a really good understanding around in terms of that. And I've again, after I finish this book on data debt, it may be something that we're going to dive into, my writing partner Todd and I, to take a look at. But certainly, I think there would certainly a relationship between the level of the organizational maturity and the role that culture would play. So we'll see whether that comes about or not. But I don't have any good hard and fast data on it yet, and we'll have to do a little bit more working on it. Again, Sonia, any thoughts on that aspect of it?
Yeah, we've touched this a few times with some clients as well, right? Because even some of the approaches that we offer, some would probably resonate more to more mature organizations, right? More mature organizations would probably be more after the latest and greatest in terms of how to effectively and efficiently manage data, just because the scale is larger in terms of data volume and data issues and what they're trying to achieve. Versus perhaps a company that might either be smaller in size and maybe less mature, or maybe their, requirements are not as, high. They might themselves just want something completely different and a little bit less, I would say, complicated, and to some degree, right? Maybe something simple that just meets their basic needs. And that in itself might be okay for them. And I'll give you an example, right? Data privacy. Data privacy is a huge one. Depending on the organization, a smaller organization, they might be able to, deal with data privacy through access controls. And that might be sufficient with some of the technologies that they use, right? Or maybe they have homegrown technologies, and that might be okay. Once you start getting to having more requirements in terms of volume of data, in terms of types of data, in terms of now having to deal with multiple geographies, it becomes a lot harder to keep up with things. And then from that perspective, you start understanding as an organization that you need to kind of mature to the next level. And then you start trying to understand what's out there, right? What are the most mature data approaches that can better address your needs, and what technologies are out there. And then that's where you start hunting, for what's available. And that might lead you more to a mature state, right? As opposed to an organization that is more on the journey still to get there.
Well said. I can imagine layering on multiple types of competing regulatory environments would even further complicate that sort of thing. So it certainly makes sense.
And a couple of people have mentioned that DCAM also talks about culture. So there's a model
There are
there.
some things in DCAM. Yeah, I guess I'll have to go back and revisit that. But they do have aspects. DCAM is focused mainly on very large organizations. So that would also tend to reinforce the point that Sonia made earlier of larger organizations requiring a different level.
Indeed. Well, that is all the questions that we have for today. Everyone's very quiet. It's the end of the year. It's the end of the season. But I'm so excited. But there was lots of kudos. Oh, we got one more question coming in. I love it. So because we have a little time left. Will AI usage be a standard component in mature organizations of data governance?
Sonia, one of the things we're trying to figure out is how should AI come into the DM BoK wheel? And again, you saw that earlier there. We're open to suggestions. In fact, our recruiting people actively to start working with us in that area around that. So let me just put the DM BoK wheel up there and see if that sparks anything. I'm not sure I can get that to work. There we go. And there's the wheel. So where does AI fit? We're looking at this. By the way, the biggest question that we're getting at DAMA in general is, I want a wedge to do this, and I want a wedge to do that. And we're already up to about 85 wedges if we acceded to all the requests. So we're going to have some real good work to try and figure out where that actually goes. But Ed, what do you think, Sonia? Where would we put AI? Would it be a part of data management, or is data management simply a feeder into it and AI should be separate?
I see it kind of both ways. This is also another topic that we talk a lot about within IBM. We see it as two dimensions. We see where I spoke more about today about data management for AI, right? How to get your data ready for AI. And a lot of that really revolves around making sure that you have your data with high quality, trusted, right? That you can access it easily, that from a price standpoint, it doesn't cost, an extremely large amount of money to access, right? Because then it minimizes your profit. But if you think about it, right, then there's the other way around. It's how can you accelerate specific things that depend on your data having high quality. For example, data governance. Data governance in the central wheel here, there's many different facets of it. If you leverage AI technology to accelerate how data governance is achieved, then that also is a role, right? So it's kind of data management for AI, but then there's AI for data management or data governance. One area that we have used it specifically in, we call it semantic search. And what that does is it uses AI models behind the scenes to essentially enable suggestions to specific users that are trying to create business context around data. It's really just all about how do we make it very easy for consumers to find data, and what's the right business context that you can associate to that data. But it's just, we're talking about so much data that you just can't do this one for one, right? This is where you use AI technology to automate it. You use it so that it's intelligent enough to give you the correct business context and then be able to make those associations. And that in itself helps you just with data discovery, right? And assigning business metadata to technical data.
I always learn something from these as well. Sonia, thank you for that. It's great, great
No
thoughts.
problem.
So pop them forward.
Perfect. Oh, so that is bringing us to the end here. Again, thank you both so much. Thanks to IBM for sponsoring today's webinar. Sonia, it has been such a pleasure to have you joining us today. Very valuable insights. And thanks to all of our community for being so engaged in everything that we do. We really appreciate it. And again, just a reminder to everybody, I will send a follow-up email by end of day Thursday with links to the slides and links to the recording of this session. Thank you all. Hope you all have a fantastic day.
Holiday season, and we'll see you next year.
Yeah, happy holidays.
Thank you.